Hey, everybody, welcome back to a new episode of the Hemmings Hot Rod Barbecue. On this episode, I am joined by my colleague, Terry McGean from Hemmings, and we are talking about SEMA. We're going through a SEMA recap. We're talking about some of our favorite vehicles, what we saw, and what we think the future is of this big-ass event that's been there, well, for quite a long time. So, Terry, first off, welcome to the podcast yet again. How many SEMAs has this been for you? What do you think?
Oh man, my first was 1995, believe it or not.
Woo!
And I didn't do the math. I want to say that's probably 28.
Well,
Uh,
that's a lot.
I might be off by one or so there, but yeah, since 1995. So been a long time.
Okay, so then you're the absolute person that's how has SEMA changed over the years, in your opinion?
Well, it certainly has changed a lot. And it's funny because when I started going in 1995, it had been going on for a long time prior to that. One of the things I think is interesting is, I've been into cars my whole life and I've been
Mm-hmm.
reading car magazines since I was a little kid. I was reading Hot Rod from the time I was 10. However, I did not know that the SEMA show even existed until probably 1993, when by that time I was out of college and I was
Yeah.
working. A friend of mine got a job with Hyundai Corporation. So this was separate from Hyundai Motors.
Okay.
And he was working on a project where they were trying to get involved in importing auto parts. So he went to the SEMA show and I'd never heard of it. And he came back and he was like, "You got to go to this thing. You would have loved it." And he went on and
Hmm.
on and on about it. I
Yeah.
had never heard a word about it. So the significance there is it was still at that point a very much an industry trade show and was
Yeah.
not at all intended for consumers. The following year, I had gotten my first magazine job and I had started in September. And I always think about this. I was an ad sales guy actually, and they were all going to SEMA. And I was like, oh, cool. I'm going to get to go.
Yeah.
And my new boss is like, no, you're too new. You don't know what you're
Huh.
doing. You can't go yet. And I was like, ah. And then one of the salespeople abruptly quit.
Oh.
I was like, okay, cool. Now I can go in her place.
Yeah. Here's my shot.
No, you don't know what you're doing. You can't go. And I was like, oh, so that killed me a little bit. I did get to go the next year. Um, and it's funny because I always remind myself of this too. I always walk by the spot and I did it again this year. I remember being there that year and there was in one of the halls a 67 Chevelle and it was a nice car. It
Yeah.
wasn't in anybody's booth. It was just sort of on display in one of the halls. And what strikes me and what I always remember is it was very unusual that there was an old muscle car there because at the time it was all, if there were any vehicles, they were new. And
Really?
um, there really was no, and some people may tell me I'm wrong about this, but my recollection is there really were no old cars and there were no old muscle cars. And I remember having a discussion with the guy who was my boss and another guy who was an ad sales guy for another magazine company. And I remember saying, there should be more of this. This car is
Yeah.
just sitting here. It's getting a lot of attention. People think it's cool. My boss was sort of like, oh yeah. And he didn't really know. He wasn't actually into cars. And the other guy from the other company went on and on about how no, nobody cares about this. And what's important is Jeeps. And he went on and on about Jeeps.
Hmm.
And Jeeps are important, obviously, and there's still a lot of Jeeps at the SEMA show. But from that time until now, of course, we've seen the explosion of SEMA show
Oh,
cars.
yeah.
This was not the case back then.
Well,
And you did not
everything is a
have,
show car now, right?
yeah,
I mean, there's not you would be I think the only show cars or non-show cars that you would see, um, were there any non-show cars? I think everything was a show car. Right? I mean, Toyota
yeah,
had a little display and they had like the Land Cruisers, but that was it. Everything else was a full-on custom build and everything else. But speaking of Toyota, they were really the only manufacturer that was there. Everybody else had pulled out. Dodge and Mopar pulled out, GM had pulled out, Ford had pulled out.
yeah,
Um, so it really was this was really a year of the customs because every single car there was modified or something. And I don't know if I would call just SEMA a consumer trade show or an industry trade show. I feel like SEMA is almost trying to find its legs again as to what it actually is and what its purpose actually is.
Yeah, I mean, I think the move away from being strictly an industry show started a long time ago.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, from being there every year, I mean, it's been a long time since, I mean, the show's been super crowded for years.
Oh
And
yeah.
as you walk around, you can tell there are legions of people who are, they're not there for work.
No.
They're there because they're enthusiasts and they knew somebody who could get passes and they're
Yeah.
there. And SEMA has known those people are there for a long time. And if they didn't want them there, they would have changed it.
Sure. Of course.
I think they like the numbers. I think they like the buzz that has come from the world knowing what the SEMA show is,
Yeah.
because again, it's amazing to me today to think that when I was in my 20s, I had no idea what this thing was. So, but yeah, there has been a recent shift with the OEs kind of pulling out, and even the OEs, you were talking about custom cars, GM and Ford and Dodge have all had special
Oh
vehicles made
yeah.
for the SEMA show, in
Mm-hmm.
addition
I mean,
to
hell,
the,
we made one this year.
yeah.
We had actually done the Hornet, our little Hornet GT that we made into the GLHS wide body, and Mopar pulled out, Dodge pulled out, and but I mean, we still had it there. We were fortunate enough to get it in the Hoonigan booth, so big
Mhm.
props to Hoonigan for letting us do that. But yeah, they and here's the thing, also in like to your point, GM when their booth was there, they always had some kind of custom, some kind of retro custom. Dodge always had some kind of custom, whatever the case is. Ford, same thing. It was just it was strange. It was strange not seeing them because I always feel like the OEMs are to an extent the glue that holds the SEMA show together.
I think their presence, in a sense, almost legitimizes what we do, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we know that we like this stuff, and I think we know that it's a little crazy sometimes, and all of
Mm-hmm.
us are into this. How much we care about it, and how much money we're willing to spend on it, and time and everything.
Yeah.
And I think that seeing the Ford Motor Company and General Motors there engaging in the same kind of stuff that we engage in by not just having stock new production vehicles, but taking the time to build custom versions of new vehicles, custom versions of decades old vehicles
Yeah.
sometimes. It kind of legitimizes like, yeah, we're not crazy. If General Motors thinks they should do this, then it must be a worthwhile pursuit, right? And of course, they're just trying
Yeah.
to appeal to us, but that's I've always felt like that really shows how important what we are interested in is.
Oh yeah, that I totally agree. Let me ask you this: did you have any? Because I mean, we were busy. I mean, I know you were busy. I was busy. We all had meetings because, to your point, yeah, there's a lot of people that walk around there and just are enthusiasts to see the show because they knew somebody. We're actually working, so we were busy from Monday all the way to Friday, and it was one of those things where when if you get a chance to start to walk the show, you get a little idea of kind of what's out there. But were there any standouts to you? Were there any trends that you saw aside from the Bluetooth drive shafts and the non-brake line trucks that were sitting out front that were all.
I don't know if could pick out a particular trend. I feel like it was a continuation of stuff we've seen, which is a good thing. From my point of view, a good thing is there's still a lot of classic muscle cars there on the floor
Yeah.
and a lot of fresh builds. Um, and the continuing trend there would be um, modernizing
Yeah.
classic muscle cars.
Absolutely.
One that stands out in my mind was there was a GTO that I think was a
Yeah.
67 that
Kevin
was a,
Hart's car, right?
oh, was that his? No, not
Well, it
not
was
um
the
he had the
brown one.
69
Okay.
convertible that was in the Holly booth. That's what you're
Yes.
thinking.
Yep.
Yeah, that's a very cool car. I was thinking of a 60, I think 7 or 6.
Okay.
That was gray that I think was in the McGuire's booth, not far
Okay.
from it. Also cool. Both cars heavily modernized. I'm thinking of the Ring Brothers 69 Charger.
Yep. Saw that.
Um,
Beautiful.
you know, I you and I were talking about this when we were at the show. Of course, you and I both like muscle cars a lot, and I like upgrading muscle cars. I like the idea of integrating newer drivetrains and
Sure.
tech. I'm not always a fan when people start moving bits of classic cars around, you know.
Yeah, I kind
Um,
of I'm with you on that. I
some of these
think
cars, they just got the look and the lines and everything so right. If you want to modify it, that's great. But when you start really changing the dimensions of the car, sometimes that doesn't work for me. I can't think of any examples of that I saw this year. I have seen stuff like that other times. I've
well,
said,
some of these cars are so gorgeous out of the gate. The designers put so much time and effort and that to modify them to that much of an extent is kind of a crime.
I
Um,
agree.
with the modernization that you're talking about, I saw one car there, one, and it was it was like a 67 or 68 Barracuda. It was that gray one,
Yep.
and it was the only car there to my knowledge, and I didn't get a chance to walk the entire show, but it had a 318 small block with a carb, totally raced out. It was the only kind of traditional small block slash big block car that I saw. Everything else, and I could have been wrong because again, I didn't walk the whole show. Everything else was transplant. Everything was transplant.
Yeah, you're going to see obviously a lot of that at SEMA. That's kind of where a lot of that stuff, I don't know, SEMA show kind of spurs some of that, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Last year, you remember our friend Steve Strope had a 67
Yeah.
Chevelle there prominently displayed. And one of the things I thought was cool about that was it had a big block in it, big block
Yeah.
Chevy.
Yeah.
Right, that Barracuda had a traditional Mopar small block. I'm trying to think of what else I saw because I feel like I did see something that had the traditional motor, and I was glad to see it. Because we're to the point now where I still like LS swaps, and I still feel like
Sure.
I haven't gotten to do one yet, so I still want to engage in that. But you almost hear groans from people when they walk up to a car and they look in and it's got an LS in it sometimes. And some of that is, it's like the same thing you would hear at street rod shows when guys would walk up in a car to have a small block Chevy. It's like, oh, I've seen this already. Well, I mean, don't,
There's a reason it's being done.
yeah,
You
don't
know.
disparage too much out of the gate. But I, there's part of it that I do get. And if I manage to put an LS in something of my own, I will not be able to impress anybody with that. They're going to, because they've already seen it
Well,
before.
it's
But we know
interesting
why
though.
people do it, right? Because the newer engines make so much power, and they seem to do it a lot more efficiently. And in some cases, like with an LS, it seems so easy to make power. In some cases, so cheap because you can buy truck engines really cheap.
Absolutely. Well, it's
Um,
still the reliability too, right? And I
yeah,
mean, that is the nice part, right? A modern drivetrain is just that. It's modern. It's EFI. It's mileage. It's variable valve timing. It's everything else, and you get the confidence to get in those cars and drive everywhere. Now, you and I are in the generation that we grew up with carburation, so for us, it's not a big deal, right? You can fiddle with it and get it back on the road, at whatever. And there are still people that swear by carburetors, and that's totally fine. Um, but there is something really nice about getting 22 to 25 miles a gallon, where your big block was getting 8, and you're making another 150 horsepower over what your big block made, and it's lighter and it's more efficient. So I get it, but yes, there is a very endearing quality about looking under the car, and especially an older car, and being like, "Holy crap, there's still a big block in there."
and
That's
the
kind of
funny thing
cool.
is, with old cars with their old engines, at least in the hot rodding world, and talking about sort of the reliability and livability of it. I mean, if you had fill in the blank of any older 60s, early 70s
Hmm.
car, and it was mostly stock or mildly modified, you and I know they're perfectly reliable if the car is put together right. I mean, they were back then and they should be now.
Right? Oh yeah.
But it's our tendency to change things a lot. I think like, well, 350 horsepower, that's not enough. I need
Right.
500. And then now you've got, so the Hemming Chevelle might be a good example. The 69
Yeah.
Chevelle SS 396 convertible we have, it had the stock 396 and a turbo 400 in it, and it ran great. And you could drive it anywhere and it would start right up. But it wasn't that fast. It was kind of little on the snooze side.
Yeah.
And so we put a crate 427 in it and an overdrive trans. Um, the upside is a lot more power. The overdrive means you can drive it on the highway more easily now, but the cam in that motor is a little more raucous than we probably should have done for a cruiser car.
Yep.
The torque converter is a little looser than we should have done for a car like that. And I think that is that's what happens to a lot of us, right? Well, I just want a little bit more. And if
It's a
I,
slippery slope.
it is. And if I went back, and we'll see what happens. I think we still want to run that car down the track and see what it'll do. But if we were to pull just a little cam out of it, make it a little more torque oriented, a little less horsepower, tighten the converter up a bit, because it's really not a drag car. It doesn't need a 3,000 stall converter, and it makes a ton of torque, so it doesn't really need that high of a
Yeah.
stall. That car would probably go back to being even more enjoyable on the road and as a road trip car.
Yeah. Well, I think
And
there's the key, right? I think a lot of times, especially when you do walk around SEMA, you'll see all these different vehicles with these different drivetrains and power plants and everything else. And I always ask the people, why did you build it? What's the purpose of this car? Like when people come to myself, and I'm sure that you get the questions too, I want to build a car. My first question is why, and what do you want to do with it? Right? If you just want to lump around town and you want something that's cammed out, that sounds, wicked, fine. But if you want to actually drive it, it's very difficult to make an old car into a great driver. And by a great driver, what I mean is turnkey, cruise it on the freeway at 75, 80 miles an hour with the AC on, with proper door or window seal so you don't feel like you're getting blown out of the car, with proper suspension. And going around SEMA, maybe there was one or two cars that I said, yeah, I could do that in. Everything else, I was like, I would probably enjoy that for about a half an hour.
yep.
And then I'd want to get out of it and just walk in the other direction, because I think people are focusing so much on excess. They're not focusing at all on drivability and comfort. And that's a big thing. I mean, we're not 17 anymore. Like I want my stuff to work and be comfortable.
Yeah, you're right on the money there. I mean, and this is really just the hot rodding tendencies that have been going on for years. Like I said, like
Right.
we just can't help it. And it's amazing how often this comes up. And even guys who've been at it for a real long time, oh, I'm putting a car together. Got to get an engine for it. Hey, here's a nice, pretty solid small block, again, 350 horse.
Mhm.
Right? Perfect. Well, 350, that's really not enough. And the torque converter thing comes up all the time. And that always makes me cringe because, again, high stall torque converters are great for drag racing, right? It help you
Mhm.
reach for 60 foot if, as long as you get the right one for the car you got. But it's amazing how many people I see, like they're building a car not to drag race, just to drive. Oh, I got to get that. I don't know, man. Do you think a 3,500 stall is going to be okay? I think
Terry,
that's,
perfect example. Look at my Charger. What was the stall that I said in there? 4,200 or some bullshit
yeah,
like
it
that,
was pretty big.
which was crazy. And we went down to a 2,600, or
Mm,
2,800 stall. And the difference is unbelievable with the lockup on it. And it's like, that's one of those things where it's sometimes you have to stop and you have to have a voice of reason somewhere out there in the ethos that
yeah.
is guiding you around, because it is very difficult to just start reading about things and say, well, I want this and I think I wanted to do that. But then you drive it and you go, this combination sucks. Like, this is terrible.
Yep.
So it's, I think, again, it always comes back to the question of what are you going to do with the car? And walking around SEMA, you would think that everybody at SEMA was going to try to go, 7 seconds in the quarter mile at 170 miles an hour and then run drag week, right?
Yep.
But I didn't see anything there that was built to really drive. Like I mean, yes, I mean there was some stuff, but so much of the stuff was so overdone. And there was a couple of cars. I think it was in the mother's booth. There was a beautiful that blue GTO that was in there with the red interior. I don't know if you saw
Yeah,
that.
that's the car I was talking about
That's the
before.
car you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
That was so well done and so tasteful. And you looked at it and you go, I would drive across the country if I think it's as
Assuming
good as I
it
hope
worked
it
right.
is.
Yeah.
Yeah, assuming it worked right, that would be the car, because not only was it tastefully done, from an aesthetic point of view, but the interior was beautiful. It had the right power plant in it. I think it had an LT4 or something like that. So you're probably talking 600 horsepower, which is more than enough.
Oh yeah.
But again, it looked like a very high end driver, and that is, I think, one of the biggest compliments you can pay to, like, that's why I love strobe stuff. Like every time I see strobe stuff, Steve concentrates on stuff that's like, let's make it aesthetically pleasing, let's give it enough power, let's not overdo it, but make sure it runs perfectly and goes down the road and you're enjoying it.
Yeah.
And that's what I love about stuff like that.
Everything you're talking about with the SEMA show and making cars actually functional, this all kind of leads to the genesis of the Optima streetcar challenge
Yeah.
program, which was a while ago. And that was essentially when pro touring was really the hot trend.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody said, hey, you guys are building all these cars and you bring them to the SEMA show, and they barely, I bet half of them couldn't get from the
Don't
SEMA
run.
show to the trailer. Right.
Yeah.
So they created that competition where you have to drive the car to the road course, run the road course. I think there was an autocross and a drag
Yeah.
race. They're still doing it. I think that was a really interesting concept, and interesting too that it grew out of the SEMA show, basically specifically calling out SEMA cars, because that's
Mm-hmm.
become right, SEMA cars. I think the level of competition in that event has raised to the point where they are now again back to being race cars,
Well,
essentially.
I mean, I ran that event in 2011, right? And I ran it in the Daytona. And I remember when I got selected and I got asked to do it, and it was streetcars. I said, okay, fine. So I drove the Daytona from San Francisco to the SEMA show, which is 600 miles each way, with a box of tools in the trunk, and said, okay, well, let's do this. I got there only to find out that the on-road portion was like 40 miles. And I was like, what is this bullshit? I was like, are you kidding me? This is a streetcar. And people were back then, it was, LSs and everything else and tube chat. And I was like, wait a second. I showed up in a car with AC, full interior, carbureted, all this stuff. These are not street cars. What I'm seeing right now are full-on race cars.
Yeah.
And so that's when it started to kind of jump the shark a little bit, and it was still kind of in its infancy. But now these cars are pushing 1,000 horsepower or more. They're full tube chassis cars. They are not street cars. Are they streetable? Meaning, can you drive them on the street? Sure, but you could do that with a rat rod too. But it doesn't mean I want to drive it across the planet.
Right.
So it's one of those things where, what is your definition of a street car? And more importantly, is that what your goal is when you set out to build it? If you set out to build a full-on race car, that's one thing. But a street car is different. A street car with power and comfort is totally different. And I don't know if it's an age thing. That is absolutely what I gravitate to now. I want something with the power and the performance and the handling and the braking, but I don't want to be destroyed after I drive it anymore.
Yeah. Well, and what I find is if you have a car, you get to this point where, am I using my car? How often do I use my car? And a lot of times I think for a lot of people, it's because, well, I can't just jump in the car and go here, go there. It's an event to use the car,
Mm-hmm.
because again, it's too, either it's too unpleasant to drive, or it's too radical
Yeah.
to casually use, or both. And I think, when we look back, like, why do we like these cars? How do we get into this? Oh, well, I had the fill in the blank car years ago, and I went everywhere with that car, and I did this and I did that with it. And you're like, well, yeah, and that version of that car that you had was much closer to stock than maybe the version
Mm-hmm.
that you created years later.
Right.
So again, I tell myself, like, I still have that, oh, I need the biggest, baddest, coolest. But again, when I have time, I want to be able to use the car. And I would like to use stuff to do events, because that's another thing. Like,
Yeah.
what am I using the car for? Would be cool to, again, fill in the blank, take it to an autocross,
Sure,
or
of course.
go on power tour or something.
Yeah.
So yeah, a little restraint maybe. We have seen cars over the years, and a lot of transplant cars even, that do many things well.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I'm thinking of a car right now. Maybe you remember this. Some years ago, it was at SEMA too. Mike Copeland from
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Mike is a
Arlington.
builder, and he had cars there this year. He actually had a monster truck there that I think he had a hand in powering with one of his hydrogen fueled
Yeah.
engines. Um, Mike for a time built cars for GM for their
Hmm.
show cars, in addition to having his own business. And some years ago, when GM came out with the E-Rod package, remember that? It was
Yep.
a
Oh, sure.
modular crate. Um, Freiberger at Hot Rod went and got a 79 Camaro Z28 because
I remember that, the orange one. He wanted to
yep,
do an E-Rod. Yeah,
he wanted
absolutely.
to
I remember
get
that
a
car.
smog
Yep.
era car that in California had to comply because that is still a problem in California. Bought that car. I think Mike built it with the E-Rod, which
Hmm.
was an LS3. I think that was
Yep.
like a 2010 Camaro engine. So 426
Yeah.
horsepower, I
Plenty of
think.
power.
I think maybe the crate is rated at 430, like the Corvette or something. Um, 5-speed Tremec. I think they
Yeah.
built I think they built a 9-inch for it with a reasonable gear. I think it had bolt-in suspension from somebody,
Yeah.
might have been Hotchkiss, can't remember. Uh, Paint job, seats, wheels,
Yeah.
tires,
Just a nice car.
done. If I'm not mistaken, that car with the 5-speed ran 11s with a stock crate engine.
Dude,
Um,
that's like how fast. This is the whole point, right? How fast do you want to go? And I look at it now, and I just spent a ton of money on my 68 Charger, making it streetable. And it was always a road car. Always. It was never a race car. It was always a road car. But putting in that combination where it now has AC and power windows, and it's a truly enjoyable driver to get into and just go, right? Where other cars like my Daytona, that's 900 horsepower. That's an absurd thing. It's a party. It's a carnival ride, right? That you have to be prepared to drive. It's not like you want to drive it across the planet because it'll bite you. So you say, well, where is that great kind of middle spot? And it's interesting. We're talking about this, and I'm going back. I just keep thinking of production cars, and I'm going back to your Impala SS. For those who don't know, Terry's got an Impala SS. That is such a great example of a factory built, you know, muscle car that gives you every comfort. And this was yours is what, 95, 96?
Mine's a 96.
96. So factory built muscle car, yeah, it's 30 plus years old, whatever the case is, and that's fine.
Yeah.
But you know what? It's comfortable, it's big, it's got power, it will handle, it will stop, it does all this stuff. And I think that if some of the SEMA builders would go back and they would look at cars, OEM cars, like an Impala SS, a Marauder, which wasn't fast, but fine, a Marauder, a Pontiac G8 or a Chevy SS, even looking at Euro sedans, M5s, right? M6s, stuff like that. What does it take? What would it take to make a really old car that good to where
Mhm.
it's turnkey, reliable, enjoyable, comfortable? That to me is a fabulous automobile. That style of automobile, they're great. They're just
The
wonderful.
the funny thing about the Impala SS is it really is an old car that
Oh yeah.
it's like a factory updated old car because the chassis under that car, 96 is the last year for that platform. Um, Not only does that chassis go back, I think most people know this, 91 was the first year of that body style, but the chassis goes back then to 77 under full size cars. And I don't know if everybody knows that chassis goes all the way back to 73 under the colonnade cars.
Right.
So, and the front suspension on that car traces all the way back to the 70 Camaro and Firebird. And
Way to make your margins, GM.
so, yeah, they get their money's worth out of that hardware. And what was sort of interesting about that is it really was, even in 96, a new old car. They put a
Right.
new motor, newer overdrive trans,
Yeah.
four-wheel disc brakes, big sway bars. They put 17-inch wheels on it. Um, it almost was like Detroit building sort
Yeah.
of a resto mod muscle car. And the
Yeah.
funny thing too is, I mean, that car only is rated at 260 horsepower, which now people would just be like, oh my
Yeah.
God, it's nothing. And it's not a ton. And I think a stock Impala SS would run, with good air and everything happening right, like a 15.1 maybe.
Still quick.
For what it was at the time, it was great. You mentioned the G8. One of our friends, Brian Van Zant, who helps us here with video, he has a Caprice cop car from,
Yeah.
the ones that were the same as a G8. I
Right.
think It's a 14 that he has. Bone stock, over 100,000 police miles on it. Took it to the drag strip, ran a 14.0. Okay, and
That's fast.
it's a big car, with a lot of use on it to still run 14.0. And if you were to get the Chevrolet SS version that had more power and a manual trans available, that would be a lot faster. So all the stuff is there, and like that Camaro I mentioned earlier that Mike Copeland built, the hardware is there and the cars are there. I think it all just keeps coming back to selection and combination of these things, because you and I both know there's a lot of pro touring or resto mod cars that have a spec sheet that looks really impressive, but you get in the car and nothing works right, or
No.
the elements don't go together. But conversely, there have been a bunch of cars built that really do work, and it's amazing
That's
available out there.
The biggest thing on those cars is the details, right? There's the devil is in the details. It 1000% is. But here's the thing: details are really expensive, and this is what people don't understand. You guys will go to SEMA and you'll see all these wonderful cars out there, and they give you ideas and they inspire you and all this stuff. But it's the details that make the difference. And what I mean by that is the wiring done correctly? Are the squeaks and rattles out of it? Are the door panels screwed in, not using sheet metal screw? Like, there are so many things that you can build a car, but after you build it, is it a fully sorted machine? And, the beauty of an OEM car is they spend billions of dollars making sure that they're perfect, that you get in and just turn the key. To do that on a custom car, my God, is it time consuming? My God, is it arduous to go through and make a car like that? But that's where your money comes in, right? So if you're going to ever go to a builder and, the car's got to be perfect. The car's going to be great. You're going to love it, blah, 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 blah. And then you get out, something rubs, something squeaks, something hits, something this, something that. There is you're taking stuff that, trying to make it do what it was never meant to do. And can you do it? Sure. But my God, that extra 10% at the end, that's where your money is.
Well, and that is, if you're working with a builder, that's where you get the value of their experience, right?
Yeah.
If it's a good builder, if you're part of this, I think comes in the planning stages, right? Because again, you just got to fight that tendency to just check off the biggest, baddest everything you can get, if you're fortunate enough to be able to buy the biggest, baddest. You mentioned, the OE engineering. I mean, part of the transplant thing ought to be benefiting from that engineering, bringing that engineering to your car, which you can do in some of these cars we've talked about, do that. But then sometimes some of us undo that by, that's a great crate engine, but the cam's a little too small, or I just need to, one of our colleagues, we're working on that Chevy Blazer project. It's going to be a 4-wheel drive truck. It should be pretty cool. It has an LS. We have a crate that's a 6-liter that should be plenty strong. I'm going to say it's a 450 horse rating, but it's probably got a ton of torque, which should be perfect for a 4x4.
Yep.
Well, there was some discussion about building another motor for it, and big cylinder heads and rowdy camshafts. All that stuff is wrong for a 4x4 that's going to be used either on the street and as a 4x4 on a trail, putting a hot rod engine in it. But it's those tendencies. I just need a little more power.
It is. You got to pull the reins back, people. I mean, that's so. Let me ask you this, Tara. On, for SEMA, what was your takeaway? What did you come away with? Do you think that the attendance was down? Because for me, it felt, this year it felt different. I felt like attendance was, I don't want to say it was down. It felt a little light compared to last year. I absolutely missed the inclusion of the OEMs. I really did. I think that's a big thing, and I really hope they decide to come back next year. I know the strike screwed a lot of stuff up, the UAW strike. I would love to see builders focus more on true drivability and go that extra 10%. As I saw a lot of unfinished stuff, which drives me insane. Then the other thing is, I would really like to see more information on these vehicles, because there are hundreds of, there's 1,000 vehicles there plus whatever the case is, and you see them at SEMA and you never see them again. I
Yeah.
want to know where these vehicles are afterwards. I want to know if they've been used. And I've done some research and tried to find stuff. It's like they build them, they go to SEMA, and then they're never heard from again. And that drives me insane.
Yeah, you do want to see these things getting used for sure. And it would be nice, to see more of them turn up again. And maybe we will see some of these cars out there at events, because more and more of these events, um, and this is a good thing, lean into actually using cars, which is cool. Um, my take on the show, I initially thought attendance was down, and then because on the first day it seemed very relaxed,
Yeah.
although it usually is on the first day, but I thought it was lasting longer than I thought it normally did. On Wednesday, I was standing in a booth talking to somebody, and during the time I was standing there talking to them, I could feel the hordes gathering at my back, because I
Yeah.
was standing with my back to one of the main aisles in the central hall. And I don't know what happened. I was talking to a couple people a few minutes later. It was like they opened the floodgates and people just started pouring in.
Yeah.
It did get crowded, as it has, well, for many years. Um, I can't tell if it was maybe a little bit less crowded than it usually is, because our booth, or Hemmings booth, moved, and it
Yes.
used to be right on an aisle that would get shoulder to shoulder on by
Correct.
Wednesday. We actually have a better spot now. I think more highly visible spot, but the aisles are broader, and I think the pressing masses aren't as apparent at that location.
Yeah.
Definitely think the number of exhibitors was off this year,
Hmm.
and I think we are going through a cycle that is still, um, probably the trailing of the COVID period, right? Because there was one show that didn't happen because of COVID. There was
Yeah.
another one that attendance was low because of COVID. And now that, the world in that regard is mostly back to normal, I think we're going through a cycle where some companies enjoyed the year of not spending that money.
Sure.
And so they've reassessed. But I kind of feel like it is a cycle and it's probably going to swing back. Um, there was lots of foot traffic, lots of people telling us that things went well. Our own people who were, excuse me, out in the trenches, kind of talking to people and trying to make business happen,
Oh
seemed like
yeah.
things went well.
Well, we were in meetings, and it's really interesting for us here at Hemmings. If you hadn't noticed, Hemmings had gone through. We just went through a massive rebrand. We updated our logo. It's not the same company it was 10 years ago. It's not the same company it was 5 years ago. So it's been very exciting for us. You might have seen the new branding on the monorail at the booth and everything else, which is really cool. We got a lot of hip stuff going on. But I agree with you, Tara. I think the show itself, I think, is a constant evolution, right? I think you have trends that come and go every year, and then you have some constants that kind of keep it in line. For me, the constant is the OEM, and I did really miss them. But listen, SEMA is always an amazing place to go. Every year you go back, you do see something you've never seen before. It gives you ideas, it inspires you, and it's great. So, what are we doing? Oh, we're coming up on an hour. Okay, so let's. This is a fast hour, Jesus. All right, so there you go, folks. Obviously, if you ever want to build a SEMA car, or any car for that matter, go to Hemmings.com. Go through the classifieds, check out our auction, buy your car there, and then call us. We'll give you suggestions on what to do. You might not like them, but we'll give them to you.
But we've got ideas. Yeah.
We've got ideas. The other thing is, please go to our YouTube channel. We've got a whole bunch of new videos coming out. Check out the magazines. Check out everything on the Hemmings websites, the auctions, the make offer pages. I guarantee we have something for y'all. Terry, as always, thank you for coming on the podcast. It is always great to just sit down and BS cars for a while with you.
Absolutely. Thanks
And
for
that's
having
it. Any closing thoughts for anybody out there?
I think our hobby is strong. I think there's no shortage of car enthusiasts out there. I came back from SEMA feeling good about all that, because we've gone through a period where they're trying to tell us that they're trying to get our internal combustion cars to go away. I feel good. I think everything's healthy and we're headed in a good direction.
I couldn't agree more. On that note, everybody, We'll see you next time on the Hemmings Hot Rod Barbecue Podcast.
Thanks for listening, folks. And again, please subscribe to the Hot Rod Barbecue Podcast. If you're on Spotify, check us out there. Subscribe to it on iTunes. And if you are going to go to YouTube, make sure you go to the Hot Rod Barbecue Podcast and hit that subscribe button. And we'll come to you every week.